The contemporary issue impacting Indigenous children today that I will be discussing is intergenerational trauma, and its effects on education. And the innovation method that I will be discussing is the App Study Scheme. I would just like to begin first and foremost by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand today, and their continuing connection to land, sea, and community. I would also like to pay our respects to elders both past, present, and future. And Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For today's focus, we'll be discussing intergenerational trauma and its impact on Indigenous youth today. And we'll be discussing app study and how it is used as an innovation method to aid closing the gap in education today. I just want to start off with these kickoff questions for you to have a little think about. Do you know what intergenerational trauma is and how it affects Indigenous people today? And is there a time limit to intergenerational trauma? I have here just a little video if you want to learn a little bit more in depth about what intergenerational trauma is. So feel free to click that if you guys want to have a watch, if the link works. By definition, intergenerational trauma is a transmission of trauma or its legacy in the form of a psychological consequence of an injury or attack, poverty, and so forth from the generation experiencing the trauma to subsequent generations to follow. So, what that looks like in Australia, essentially in Australia, intergenerational trauma predominantly affects the children, grandchildren, and future generations of those from the stolen generation. However, it doesn't solely stem from the stolen generation. Intergenerational trauma in Indigenous people can also stem from the colonization to begin with, stolen generation, and also other assimilation policies that were put in place to discriminate against Indigenous people. I also have here a little fact. Did you know fact? Um, so this fact is about epigenetics. And if you don't know what epigenetics is, it is essentially kind of a study related to hereditary genes and also genes and how they can change. And so, yeah, if you want to just have a little read of that, it basically says that the transreference of this effect is believed to be epigenetic. That is, the transmission affects the chemical marker for a gene rather than the gene itself. So, this means that the trauma experienced by the older generation is then translated into a genetic adaptation that can be passed on to successive generations. So essentially, intergenerational trauma isn't just a term that was made up to define what is happening now or the impacts that the stolen generation has had on the future generations and the Indigenous population now. There is no fiction behind intergenerational trauma. It is fact and it is science. And we see here that intergenerational trauma that we see in Indigenous youth is believed to be epigenetic. So that's very interesting. So, like we learned earlier, trauma is the experience that is passed down from one generation to another. And this can be done unknowingly and also creates a cycle of continual issues within the next generations and the generations to follow that are experiencing this trauma as well. Some of the traumas that can be passed on, and we can see this as very evident in Indigenous communities, is impacts of institutionalism, disconnection from family, emotional trauma, mental illness, and loss of identity. With impacts of institutionalism, this essentially means that when the Indigenous young people were stolen and they were taken, they were denied nurture, they were denied love, they were denied proper care, and they experienced a lot of abuse. And so they experienced a lot of institutionalism and they then passed that down onto their children because of the trauma that they went through. Um, they also experienced a loss of identity and a disconnection from family. When the stolen generation ended, the children that were stolen were not given back to their families. They were not placed back in their communities. There was no therapy. There was no efforts to um, re-immerse them back into their culture because it was simply too late and what was done had been done. And because of that, they did experience a very severe disconnection from their family and loss of identity, which also resulted in further emotional trauma and mental illness. So, and here on the right, you can just read it for yourself. But I just have kind of the facts behind what we know of the stolen generation and how that kind of affected intergenerational trauma. So feel free to have a read of that. So here I just have some facts and statistics that you can have a look at. This one just shows the Indigenous and non-Indigenous higher education participation rates by age, and this is from 2021. So you can see here that there is a severe gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. This is another graph that shows, you can see with the blue and yellow, there is a very severe gap. And here is another one as well, just to show you guys a little bit more about what this actually looks like on paper. So, as you can kind of see, intergenerational trauma has multiple effects and is a very real effect and is a very real thing that is experienced by many Indigenous people due to the trauma that they have faced. And this can result in a lack of education and many other issues that all contribute to young Indigenous children not being a part of the education system, not being motivated to be a part of the education system, or simply just being very severely behind. And another reason as well is that due to geographical isolation, it can be very difficult for Indigenous young people to access secondary education, even, and also tertiary education. So, the program that I would like to discuss is the AB Study Scheme. So the AB Study Scheme is the Aboriginal Study Grant Scheme, and it was introduced in 1969 to implement special measures to assist Aboriginal people to achieve educational objectives via financial assistance. So this involved a range of types of payments that range from covering the initial cost of education itself and the cost of a course, as well as travel allowance and living expenses as well, simply to respond to the particular needs of students and families. The purpose of this scheme is to address the educational disadvantages that are experienced in Indigenous communities because of intergenerational trauma. Um, and the scheme aims to address these disadvantages by assisting with costs associated with study. Here is just a little bit of the history of AB studies. So it was introduced in 1969 as part of the then Commonwealth Government's commitment to implement special measures to assist with education involvement. So it was created to assist with the involvement of education within Indigenous communities. The pavements covered course payments, travel allowance, living expenses, etc. And an interesting fact about it is initially it was started for tertiary education, and the government stated that primary and secondary education was the state's responsibility. So they weren't going to pay for high school, they were simply paying for tertiary education. However, it soon became evident that this wasn't working because some Indigenous students were not even eligible for tertiary education because of a lack of involvement in secondary education. So, AB study was then extended to mature age secondary students and soon after extended to all of secondary students, so year 7 to year 12. Just to kind of re highlight the main objectives. It is essentially to encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to take full advantage of the educational opportunities available, promote equity of educational opportunity, and improve educational outcomes. In case you still don't understand, a simple kind of interpretation of the policy is that the AB study policy involves consideration of the fact that it is a scheme aimed at removing some of the barriers to Indigenous Australians accessing education, and essentially is a scheme that provides allowances to people in recognition of their educational and social disadvantages. So here I just want to go over some of the advantages. One of the big advantages is education. The AB study scheme is there to provide access to education and to assist with providing that access by financially assisting disadvantaged youth in Indigenous communities. Um, it is there also to work alongside reconciliation programs. It also puts efforts into closing the gap between Indigenous youth and non Indigenous youth by creating that access to education, and also aids in getting Aboriginal students on par with non Indigenous students. And the sole reason why they aren't always on par is because of intergenerational trauma. The AB study scheme also comes with some disadvantages, and so these were some of the community concerns that I researched. One of them being complexity. The administration process is hard to understand and can result in misunderstandings because the application requires a lot of attention to detail and a lot of forms, which can be hard to understand. Much like any forms, but specifically because of some of the disadvantages faced in Indigenous communities because of intergenerational trauma, um, Reading and going through all of those forms can be very difficult. There is also a lack of awareness. The application for App Study is advertised online, which might not always be accessible to people, specifically people in um, isolated areas and remote communities. There is also a lack of support after receiving App Study funds. So essentially, App Study provides that access to education, but no further support once you are enrolled in school. This can be a severe problem because you can start to see patterns of Indigenous youth enrolling in education and taking advantage of App Study, um, but then not continuing studies or leaving early. And Boarding Australia actually addressed this issue, and they stated that App Study, as great as a facilitator as it is, has not made that jump yet to say we will pay for the outcomes of that access, not just access. So the App Study system simply provides access to secondary education. It is not linked or tied to engagement or retention. None of that is factored into the current system. So that is a big issue. These are just some more disadvantages, just again going off the lack of awareness and the assistance needed with applications. There can also be difficulties in applying because birth certificates and permanent addresses are required in the application processes, and in some cases, this can cause difficulty in completing the application. And also, due to geographical isolation, it can be difficult to have access to information about App Study and creates difficulties when preparing to leave for study. Some improvements that I believe can be made are assisted applications. So, having even face to face assistance when it comes to applying for App Study. Also, face to face advertisements of the scheme and more community outreach. The scheme is already advertised and it's already out there. However, like I mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to access advertisements about the scheme due to a lack of resources. So I think that more face to face advertisement and community outreach would be beneficial and would be able to target those areas where people may not have a laptop accessible to them. I also think there should be more comprehensive evaluation of the scheme's administration. So even like yearly evaluations of it and measuring the data and measuring where the scheme is being used most to identify the target areas that need more help and more push for support in that educational process. I also have here some improvements that are in action today. There is an App Study line 1-800-132-317 where you can call and you can get that assistance that you may need when applying for App Study. Aboriginal liaison officers in school, it is a very common practice now, and that is kind of a way of assisting with the education after App Study. Active committees to review the scheme and listen to community concerns. There is an active committee that reviews the scheme. And also, birth certificates are no longer required for applicants under the age of 16. Here is just a
Just to
final
close off,
review
this
of
is just a
everything
review of
that we have
everything
learned
that we
today.
have
And I
learnt
just want to
today.
finish off by
The impact
reminding
of
you
this
that
intergenerational
intergenerational
trauma
trauma
will
will
continue
continue
affecting
affecting
further
today
generations
and will continue
unless we start
affecting further
taking action
generations
today.
until we take action.
Breaking the cycle,
And it starts
assisting with
today
healing
and it
this
starts with
trauma and
you and it
breaking the
starts with
cycle
you.
today.
And
Breaking the
thank you so much for
cycle, it
watching.
starts now, it
Australia
starts
always
today,
was
and
and
it
it
always
starts
will be
with
Aboriginal
you
land.
and me. Whether you're Indigenous or not, we
Here
can
is
all
just a
make
final
efforts
review
into
of
breaking this
everything
cycle
that we have learnt today, and I just want to
and I
finish
just
off
want to
by
finish this off by
reminding
saying
you
thank
that
you so much for
intergenerational
watching.
trauma will
And
continue
Australia always
affecting
was
further
and always will
generations
be unless
Aboriginal
we
land.
start taking action today.